So I welcome you to the ocular oncology session, today's session. And on the panel, we have Chairman Dr. Mahesh Shanmuganan, sir. Sir doesn't need any introduction. Sir is head of vitreoretina and ocular oncology services in Shankara Eye Hospital, Bangalore. And he is a authority in the world for intraocular tumors. Very welcome, sir. And you are the chair for the session. For the co-chairman, we have Dr. Nandan Shetty, sir. Nandan Shetty, sir, is ocular oncologist, specifically treating retinoblastoma in the city of Mumbai and the Tata Research Center, which is one of the biggest and the high volume center in the country. Very welcome, sir. You will be the co-chairman for the session. We have a convener as Dr. Chinmay. Welcome, ma'am. Ma'am is an oculoplastic surgeon and she is a consultant at Minto Eye Hospital, Bangalore, and a very student-friendly teacher to have. Very welcome, ma'am. You are the convener for the session. And as a co-convener, we have Dr. Fairuz, ma'am. Ma'am has done her oculoplasty, ocular oncology fellowship from LV Prasad Eye Hospital, followed by training at Wills Eye Hospital with the Jerry Shields and the Carol Shields. And then she has done her oculoplasty fellowship with Dr. Don Gikawa. Ma'am is here as a co-convener for the session. Very warm welcome, ma'am.
Thank you so much.
As a moderator of the session, I just have to do a gentle request to all the speakers and the panelists that we need to stick to the time of the 8 minutes, and we do have a window of 15 to 20 minutes. But after this, there is one more session lined up, so we will try to stick to our time of 8 minutes. I will remind everyone, with all due respect, once the 7 minutes are done, that the 1 minute is remaining. So with the permission of chair, I would like to say Dr. Mahesh Shanmugan, sir. Sir, can you please say a few words before starting the session, sir?
Thank you for this invitation, and looks like a great program you put together. And I see all kudos in the message group. Thank you very much for the invitation. And this looks like a very interesting program as well. Let's get on with it. Thank you.
So our first speaker for today is Dr. Marian Pauly. Ma'am, will you be sharing your slides, please?
I hope it is visible. Is it visible?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
Yeah. Okay. At the outset, let me thank BOA and MYS for giving me this opportunity. In this 8 minutes time, I've tried to go through few of the masquerades in the periocular area. This is a case-based presentation. So my first case is a 56-year-old female who presented with a lid mass of 5 months duration. On examination, you can see an yellowish mass with focal mudderossus and closed meibomian gland orifices, but the skin is smooth and mobile. On everting the eyelid, that is, it has got extension to the tarsal surface. So here the diagnosis is more or less certain because it's a case of sebaceous gland carcinoma. The second case, is it a chalazion, is it a mole cyst, or is it a molluscum? So no, look at the external clinical features. Meibomian gland orifices are closed. There is a focal mudderossus and there is an extension beyond the posterior lid margin. So this is no, clear no. It's a case of sebaceous gland carcinoma. So my take-home message is a nodule that initially simulates a chalazion but later causes loss of lashes and destruction of meibomian gland orifices warrants biopsy. So in short, a chalazion also needs a follow-up, especially in age group more than 40 years. So coming to my next case, a 61-year-old female with a lid mass in the left eye of 1 year, status post INC, presented to us for a second opinion. Now you can see a focal thickening in the posterior lid margin, but there is no obvious loss of lashes. Now again, going more posterior and everting the lid, you can see a huge sebaceous gland carcinoma. Similarly, always evert the eyelid whenever we see a lid mass and see the tarsal surface, and dry INC always warrants the biopsy. Coming to the next case, she is a 47-year-old female presented to us with chronic irritation since 6 months. So on examination, there is a ptosis, mainly aponeurotic ptosis in the left eye, and if you look very carefully, minimal congestion in the left eye. So on everting the eyelid, I'm sorry for the quality of the photographs. On everting the left eyelid, you can see that the conjunctival architecture is totally lost. This is the normal tarsus and this is the abnormal lid. Looking at the lid margin, you can see blepharitis-like picture. She also needs a biopsy to rule out a Pagetod variant. Similarly, another case, an elderly female with a chronic discharge. Again, there is loss of cilia and diffuse tarsal thickening is a case of Pagetod sebaceous gland carcinoma. So it is suspected when a middle-aged or elderly unilateral blepharitis not responding to standard therapy. We need more biopsy to determine the management and further treatment. Coming to the next case, it's a 54-year-old male presented with a mass in the left eye since 3 months following an insect bite. Now look at the lid architecture. There is a mild ectropion, and on close examination, you can see telangiectatic vessels and dark nodules. But the tarsus is more or less look normal. This was a case of skin appendage tumor, that is a sweat gland mucinous adenocarcinoma of the eyelid. Another case is a 68-year-old with 3 months history diagnosed as sebaceous cyst. So on close examination, you can see loss of eyebrow lashes. Then, so on the surface, chalky white nodules, telangiectatic vessels. This also is a appendage tumor, that is pilomatrix carcinoma of the eyebrow, which we have published in OPRS, and she underwent reconstruction with H-plasty. So this is the fifth scenario, 70-year-old diabetic, 15 years with 6 months history. So she had treated with multiple doses of antibiotics. Is it fungal dermatitis? No. Look at the lid architecture. Look at the margins. Look at the surface. It's a case of morphiaform basal cell carcinoma. Now, another patient, 68-year-old male, presented with watering and discharge and swelling since 1 year, have presented to us for a DCR surgery. So on examination, you can see there is a mass, but it is extending beyond the medial canthal tangent. The globe is displaced up, periocular fullness, and there is proptosis. So this was a case of lacrimal sac carcinoma with the orbital extension. Even though it is uncommon, it can be easily mistaken for benign processes like NLDO. So always look for unusual findings when you do DCR, especially thickened sac, and do biopsy if needed, imaging in suspected cases. She is a 47-year-old female teacher presented with chronic discharge in 6 months. She has got a sensory esotropia due to a macular lesion right from childhood, and she is RHO+ positive in the left eye. So this is her external picture. On close examination, when I'm asking her to look down and out, you can see a small mass in the medial cornix. And MRI showed a mass arising from the lacrimal sac. This turned out to be lacrimal sac lymphoma. This is a 61-year-old male presented with watering in the right eye. On examination, RHO+ is negative. Syringing shows common canalicular block. And if you look very carefully, there is a superior sulcus defect, mild proptosis. And if you look at the whole examination of the face, you can see a fullness in the right maxillary region, which we never look routinely. So imaging showed maxillary sinus carcinoma with the early orbital involvement. So what are the indications for imaging in watering and a patient presents with watering? One is proptosis, then took for telecanthus and if any palpable mass. The patient was treated and he is alive and he is underwent with cataract surgery recently. So this is another patient, 43-year-old female with the drooping, treated as Horner syndrome by the neurologist and dacryoadenitis elsewhere. So on examination, there is a mild ptosis. And the MRI showed enlargement of the right lacrimal gland with diffuse infiltration of the surrounding structures. So when we again asked the history, she gave a history of CA breast treated 20 years back. Now she is 43 years and treated at the age of 23. So incisional biopsy was planned. It turned out to be metastatic adenocarcinoma. Even though she underwent the treatment, she died after 5 years of diagnosis. So acquired unilateral ptosis needs imaging. So this is my 10th case. 55-year-old presented with the puppy lids in the right eye, lipedema on and off, was on steroids on and off. He underwent imaging which showed a mass lesion. So the take-home message is persistent lipedema not responding to routine management. Always look for proptosis and needs imaging. This is another similar case treated as unilateral lipedema in a 55-year-old. If you look very carefully, there is a downward displacement of the globe. So imaging showed a pleomorphic adenoma and she underwent surgery later. This is my final case. He is a 53-year-old male diabetic, had a history of facial palsy for 4 years with exposure keratopathy. He had panophthalmitis, treated with intravitreal antibiotics since 8 months, but not responding. So this is his external eye examination picture. Now it's a panophthalmitis. But when we asked the history, he was treated for chronic lymphatic leukemia 3 years back. So he's in remission now. Since it was a painful blind time, we went ahead with evisceration under local anesthesia. And histopathology showed a diffuse large B-cell lymphoma transformation. That's called Richter syndrome. Even though it's a rare complication of CLL, the early diagnosis is very, very important. The patient expired after 3 months. So to conclude, periocular region is the window to the human body. You can have a myriad of clinical conditions and various atypical presentations. History taking is very, very important, and diffuse torchlight examination is also very, very important to detect masquerades in the periocular area. Needs regular follow-up and imaging, biopsy in suspicious lesions. It will help in avoiding the delay in diagnosis, and it will save vision and saves life. Thank you so much.
That was very nice and excellent compilation of all the cases, Dr. Marian ma'am. It was very nice to see. Any questions from the panelists do we have here? I would request Dr. Seema Das ma'am to load a presentation. Share the screen. If there are any questions, Marian ma'am, again we'll take at the end of the session and we'll get back to you. Yes, ma'am, your screen is visible. Ma'am, you are not audible. Seema ma'am.
Is it okay now?
Yeah.
Yeah, but your voice is very low, ma'am.
Is it better?
Yeah, it is much better.
Yeah. So Sumit, thanks to you and thanks to BOA and MOS for this opportunity and for organizing this very nice meeting. So I would just like to emphasize on few important points what we must know about the recent advances on the management of the eyelid tumors. So I'll be talking about few points of sebaceous gland carcinoma, BCC, squamous cell carcinoma, essentially the malignant eyelid tumors. And SGC is something which we see very often and in our practice. And we all now know that there is a new AJCC classification, the 8th edition of AJCC, which has come up for staging the malignant eyelid tumors, and which sort of is an improvisation over the 7th edition, which we have been using earlier. So just a few important points we need to know while we're using this staging system is, one is the size criteria between the T1 and the T2 staging, where in T1 earlier where less than 5 millimeter were included. Now in the new staging system, it takes the cutoff of 10 millimeter as the new criteria. So size does not seem to be matter too much between 5 to 10 as far as the prognosis is concerned, and that's probably why this change has been made. Another important change which has been made is in the T3 and T4, where the criteria for including tumors in the T3 were the resectability of the tumor, which was very subjective criteria. That has been made much more objective in the 8th edition. So the bottom line here is that the 8th edition actually helps us in predicting the local recurrence and the lymph node mets better, whereas the 7th edition probably helps in predicting the survival better. So that's what we need to know while you are using the staging system. So for us clinically, what it implies down that while we are seeing any patient of SGC in our clinic, we must know to include or measure the size of the tumor. We must look for the lid margin involvement, the involvement of the tarsus, the orbit bones, and the paranasal sinus, and document them so that we are able to stage the tumor later on as per the TNM staging. For any tumor, the management goal includes complete resection, which should include a tumor-free margin so that there is no recurrence and ensure that there is no metastasis if that has not happened earlier. So normally this is how we sort of go about excising malignant eyelid tumors. We tend to take margins from all the different sites of the tumor and then send them for histopathological examination to ensure that there are clear margins. In a small localized tumor like that, it might be easier to take the margins and demarcate the margins per se, but a tumor like this where there is a lot of congestion of the surrounding conjunctiva, sometimes it becomes difficult to pinpoint the area which should be your margin of excision. In those situations, we tend to resort to the frozen section margin control and intraoperative to guide us in the decision making. Now, we don't know what is the concordance of frozen and permanent section because there has been variable reports, and recently there are some papers now which have come up, both from, in fact, the large two papers, both are from India. What important here is to understand that both the papers talk about the sensitivity and the specificity of the intraoperative frozen for various eyelid tumors. So as we can see here, the sensitivity is 89%, whereas the specificity as well as the accuracy of intraoperative diagnosis by frozen is 99 to 98%, almost 100%. The same from the other paper, which talks about sensitivity as well as the specificity. And this talks a little bit more about the different types of tumor for BCC as well as for SGC. So what's important to understand here that though for BCC, the sensitivity and specificity both seems to be very high. But for SGC, the sensitivity is around 83% or so, whereas the specificity is 100%. So what it means in a simpler term is that we know sensitivity low means there are more chances of getting a false negative. So intraoperative frozen sometimes can give false negative specifically for SGC. So our major decision, if we want to take, is better to take based on the permanent section rather than on the frozen section. There is now a recent paper from the Shields group, which talks about a posterior lamellar resection, a complete resection of the posterior lamella, because they found that the new tumors which have come up in patients who were initially margin negative has come from a different area of the eyelid, not from the edges of the previous excision. So that's a rationale for excising the whole of the tarsus, even if a small part of the tarsus is initially involved with the main tumor. So skip lesions are common in SGC. There can be multicentric lesion, and that's the rationale for kind of taking this approach of a complete posterior lamellar excision. The pagetoid spread is something, again, which we see quite commonly presenting as a persistent unilateral blepharoconjunctivitis in our patient. And in these patients, we routinely resort to something known as a MAP biopsy, where small bits of conjunctiva are taken from multiple sites as per a protocol, and these are then seen under the microscope to see if there is any intraconjunctival tumor spread, intraepithelial tumor spread. Now, is MAP biopsy required in all patients? Because we know that the procedure of doing a MAP biopsy is quite tedious. The histopathology is quite tedious because these are very small, minute bits of tissue which needs to be seen individually under microscope. And there are reports where there are a lot of non-diagnostic MAP biopsies from the tissues which are taken. In fact, in this study, almost 57% of all the MAP biopsies are non-diagnostic because of crush artifacts and other issues with the processing of the specimens. Now, how does a MAP biopsy correlate with the clinical suspicion? If we see this paper, what it says that they have actually taken patients who had a recurrent sebaceous gland carcinoma, and what they have found that 4 out of the 5 patients where there was a tumor recurrence, where conjunctival MAP biopsy was done, in those patients, actually the initial MAP biopsy was negative. So the site from where the tumor has arising, the new tumor, was not from the site where the MAP biopsy gave us an indication. So probably it might not be very useful routinely in all patients. And what we can predict that in some patients, like a localized tumor like this, where we find an absolutely healthy, normal looking conjunctiva, no congestion, MAP biopsy might not have some much of role. Whereas in a diffuse tumor like this, where we can't pinpoint the exact extent of the tumor, MAP biopsy definitely has a role. So in selected group of patients, yes, it is indicated and it is useful, but it might not be mandatory for all to do a MAP biopsy in all SGC. Now, what about locally advanced SGC? Now, again, there are a few papers which have come up, which kind of consolidates the role of neoadjuvant chemo for these locally advanced non-resectable tumors, where mutilating surgery like exentration might be required if we have to control or treat this tumor. Now, if 5-FU and cisplatin-based chemo has shown very good results in sort of debulking the tumor by the use of chemotherapy, so that the surgical resection becomes much less extensive. And in many cases, it can avoid the need for exentration in some patients. It can also be used in patients where the tumor has already gone out of the orbit, there is local lymph node extension, and use of neoadjuvant chemo has shown to be beneficial in those patients also.
1 minute left, ma'am.
Yes. So just a little bit about the newer developments in the new treatment modalities for SGC. A few studies have found the overexpression of cancer stem cell marker in patients of SGC who has shown metastasis. So this could be one of the potential therapeutic target as well as prognostic target to show the bad prognosis cases and also to develop some future therapeutic targets in those directions. Immune checkpoint inhibitor, the antagonist to them, there are important role of the antibodies, and these are now commercially available for use in various other tumors, and probably even for eyelid tumors soon they will have an important role. Cost is a factor, but over a period of time, probably once we start using them more often and they are much more readily available, that should be beneficial in a selected group of patients. BCC, we all know the role of Vismodegib or Erivedge. Again, cost here is a factor, but in selected group of patients like this, the sclerosing variant where the surgical excision might be difficult, or in extensive tumor like this can help in debulking the tumor. Another role of this drug is in patients of the basal cell nevus syndrome who keeps on getting recurrent BCC, multiple BCC, where surgical excision might not be feasible. And this drug can be used if it's available and if the patient can afford to kind of cause good tumor control. So when you suspect a basal cell nevus syndrome, we know that multiple BCC, especially in young patients, because about 20% of BCC in patients younger than 20 years will be harboring this syndrome. And there are many other cancers which can happen in this syndrome, not only BCC. It's important to know about all the other tumors which can also be present in this patient. So I think I'll stop here. Just to conclude that TNM is something we need to know about while we kind of stage our eyelid tumors. My biopsy, we need to know clearly which patients where it is indicated and how to interpret. And of course, there is a role of newer prognostic and targeted therapy in eyelid tumors. Thank you so much.
That was a really nice presentation, ma'am, with a lot of recent advances included. I have one question for you and Feiruz, ma'am, regarding the chemotherapy for the sebaceous gland carcinoma. So we give a neoadjuvant chemotherapy and followed by that excision. So in your experience, in how many such cases post-chemotherapy resection, you have got a recurrence in those cases? Like especially like you showed a case where there was a mid part of the orbit involved, and then the chemotherapy and then the resection. So in how many, like in your experience, how many cases you got a recurrence? Feiruz ma'am also had experience in this. She had presented a paper in AO on the same.
Yeah, so I had done a retrospective study of Dr. Santosh Unnavar. We had 13 cases, in fact. So we had 2 recurrences in that. One of the recurrence was because the patient deferred a radiotherapy which was advised to her. So she didn't complete the treatment. Other case was a very focal recurrence, not an extensive one. So completing a protocol, if it is involving the orbit, that's when you go ahead with the neoadjuvant chemotherapy, including the neoadjuvant chemotherapy, surgical excision with a margin-free clearance and radiotherapy, the recurrence rate is quite low. Yeah. Dr. Seema?
Yeah, agree totally, Feiruz. Yeah, so again, not too much of experience in terms of number. I think I have 3 patients. One was an old gentleman, the one whom I showed the picture, orbital involvement, who needed exenteration. The second patient we started on neoadjuvant, but after the neoadjuvant patient got lost to follow-up, got the surgery done elsewhere. And subsequently, I think about 2 years down the line, we saw her back with a metastasis into the lung. So I'm not sure whether that has something to do with the completion of the protocol per se, but there was no local recurrence. It was a distance metastasis.
So the patient who didn't take radiotherapy, she had a local recurrence as well as systemic lung mets also, yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. And now we'll go ahead with the next presentation. It's by Dr. Chinmayi, ma'am, on caruncular tumors. Please share your screen, ma'am.
Yes, Dr. Sumit. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you're audible. Voice is little low, but you're audible.
Okay. Now it's better?
Yeah, we can see your slides, ma'am.
Yeah. At the outset, thank you, Sumit, for this, and thanks to BOA and MOS. So my topic for today is the tumors of the caruncle. Yeah. Greetings from Bangalore, which is battered by COVID. Here, what we are seeing as a normal person, and as we know, the caruncle is sometimes seen and sometimes it is not.
Sorry
seen.
to interrupt. The voice is not clear, ma'am. If you can come little near your computer, the voice might become better.
Okay.
Now this is fine, ma'am.
Yeah, this is fine. Okay. So people with curricular problems many times do not take treatment unless it is large. As we can see, because it gets hidden sometime. And histopathologically, it consists of non-keratinized squamous epithelium. There are a lot of other additional tissues also because it's a derivative of the skin. So we have hair follicles, we have the accessory lacrimal glands, the sweat glands, sebaceous glands, and of course we have blood vessels and nerves. So from this small area, there are a lot of tissues from which a lot of different types of tumors can arise. So the patient comes to us when the lesion is large, and here we can see that there's quite a vascular looking lesion, and if on looking closely, we can see the fine variegated lesion, and since it is closer to the conjunctiva, most of the lesions share the characteristics of the tumors of the conjunctiva. And because of its classical appearance, so a clinical diagnosis of a papilloma was made, and I'll be sharing the histopathological pictures. And here we can see the non-keratinized squamous epithelium, and we can see a lot of papillomatosis, acanthosis, and this is the fibrovascular core here. So this confirms with our diagnosis of a squamous papilloma. Moving on to the other picture, sometimes these papillomas can get keratinized here. So you can see a lot of brown tissue. So it's a keratinized papilloma again. And treatment is a simple excision. Sometimes in younger patients, particularly in the ones who are immunocompromised, we can get papillomas, extensive ones here, like this is a recurrent papilloma. Although it was excised once, it recurred back, and we can see the growth here and extending up onto the upper fornix as well. So in these situations, I put these patients on topical mitomycin C to prevent the recurrence, and of course, thorough check for the cause for immunosuppression. Moving on to the pigmented lesions in the caruncle, just like how nevus is common in the conjunctiva, we also have nevus arising on the caruncle, and most patients come in for the cosmetic blemish. And here again, we have excised the tumor completely, and this is the postoperative appearance. And in the histopathological slide, we can see nests of this nevus cells. So these are all the nevus cells, and in the slide we can also see some of these goblet cells over here. So these are filled with mucin and some amount of infiltration with lymphocytes. So these are the other, like a flat nevus on this side. This is a really young patient with a nevus. Most of these again come in for cosmetic, and we just tell them to either follow or excise if there are any danger signs. And coming to the vascular lesions, so following a small injury, this is the patient who has come to us. And as you can see, it's quite vascular, and a clinical diagnosis of pyogenic granuloma was made. And on the histopathology, you can see a very, very vascular slide, and we can see the lobular pattern here. And we also noted here is the extensive lot of lymphocytes. Everywhere there are a lot of lymphocytes. So this was a case of pyogenic granuloma. And sometimes we also see the vascular malformations like this extending into the fornices. So this was also excised, and here we are seeing blood vessels of varying sizes, so like small vessels, large vessels, and also you can see this very large blood vessel here. So this was a vascular malformation. And as I told you earlier, since there are sebaceous glands in the caruncle, we can have some lesions coming from the sebaceous glands. And here this was a very, very long-standing lesion, and like a retention cyst was thought, but on histopathology, there was a lot of histiocytes also, and the histopathological report came as a steatocytoma. similar to the previous case, a yellow looking lesion, but look at it's conforming to the angle of the caruncle. So here, the histopathology here was more of a very, very regular arrangement. So similar to a regular gland, sebaceous gland, it was a very regular arrangement, just that there was hyperplasia. So this is a case of sebaceous hyperplasia. Moving on to the other types of lesions, we can also get squamous lesions like squamous dysplasia or a frank carcinoma. The moment we see whitish areas on a lesion, so that definitely suggests that it is keratin, and it puts a caution for us. And here again, the lesion was excised in toto. And following that, with the histopathological report of a dysplasia, he was also started on mitomycin C postoperatively, did not have any recurrence. One unusual case, again, never thought that the report would come as a malignancy. It was like a very, very well-defined thing. The only thing is that this person is an elderly female. So there was a bit of doubt that it could be a sebaceous cell carcinoma. And on complete excision with a small 2 millimeter margin, whatever was there, this was the histopathological report. Again, you can see a lot of sebaceous cells and the tumor cells with central area. So this was a diagnosis of sebaceous cell carcinoma. The clinical differentiation becomes very difficult in these sebaceous hyperplasia versus a sebaceous cell carcinoma. Of course, these lesions are very, very rare, but I just thought that to highlight the importance of getting malignant lesions in this small area. And as we can see in this data, the commonest lesion was papilloma, and then the nevus. Pyogenic granuloma, of course, is common, and like just one case of dysplasia and sebaceous cell carcinoma, some of the other studies. So in conclusion, the caruncular lesions, although they are very rare, we have to know that benign tumors are accounting for majority of the cases. And among them, the papilloma and nevus are the bulk of the lesions. And between the pre-malignant and malignant cases, the clinical diagnosis becomes difficult, and the histopathology is very much required. And there was only one case of sebaceous cell carcinoma in this series. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, ma'am. That was right on time, and that was a huge collection of caruncular tumors, more than we can see in any of the atlas at a time. Very nice presentation, ma'am. Any questions from any of the panelists?
All good. Nice series of cases.
Then we will go ahead with our next presentation by Dr. Feiruz, ma'am, on massacrates in ocular surface. Ma'am, can you please share your screen?
Yes.
So, just in the history, masquerade was the word first time used in the ophthalmology to describe a conjunctival tumors only in 1955. And today we have ocular surface lesion masquerade topic. Ma'am, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Sumit, and greetings to all, and I hope everyone is doing fine. Thanks to BOA, MOS, and especially Dr. Sumit for this kind invitation and a fantastic scientific treat. So I'm going to take you through this masquerades in ocular surface lesion, a little bit of it in the limited time available, and I have no financial disclosures or interest. So as Sumit has rightly said that ocular malignancies often share, similar kind of symptoms and signs when you compare to the most common benign and inflammatory lesions. And conjunctival tumors and ocular surface tumors, although they are visible and very easy to examine, still holds, there are certain challenges in diagnosing these cases. And today what I'm going to do is take you through some cases, take the mask and look inside. What are the possibilities of, identifying malignant lesions, most importantly? So first and foremost, a treatment-resistant chronic conjunctivitis. I'll take you through a few cases to understand it better. So this is an 18-year-old teenager with redness and watering in the right eye for the past 4 months. And she was diagnosed as a case of keratitis, been on topical treatment medications, and it has not been, resolving. So as you can see here closely, the entire cornea, diffusely, you can see this fleshy, lesion which is covering the cornea, slightly grayish in appearance. There is superficial vascularization. In fact, there are deeper vascularization which is not visible in this picture, and that is probably why the anterior segment specialist thought it could be a keratitis. But there are a few subtle signs which actually tells you that it could be something more. So as you can see here, there is limbal thickening, there is conjunctival thickening, and specks of keratin which is scattered all around near the limbus, overlying the cornea. And this was a case of cornea and conjunctival diffuse OSSN, and she was immunocompromised. So this is what you see after. The only thing that we did was interferon alpha 2b eye drops, and it resolved in 5 months after topical medications, and she has been, there is no recurrence for the past 3 years. Yet another lady, a 56-year-old lady with redness and irritation in both the eyes, in fact, for the past 1 year. And she has been on chronic medication, including lubricants, steroids, on and off redness. And if you see this picture over here, there is definitely, red congested eye. But on a closer look, so this is how her right eye looks. The temporal bulbar conjunctiva, the nasal bulbar conjunctiva has these reddish lesions, as well as in the left eye, both temporal and nasal bulbar conjunctiva, typical of these large corkscrew vessels, subconjunctival lesion, almost orangish. And the clinical diagnosis was a lymphoproliferative lesion and to rule out lymphoma. And it came out to be a Moth lymphoma, bilateral and multifocal, which was in fact masquerading as a chronic conjunctivitis in this patient without any systemic involvement. And surgical excision was all that I did in bilateral, bilaterally in this case. A very typical presentation in a 64-year-old lady with redness, discharge, and irritation for the past 1 year. More than a chronic conjunctivitis here, she has blepharoconjunctivitis. Even the eyelid is involved. As you can see here, the posterior lid margin is thickened, entire meibomian gland orifices, and the structure is altered over here. There is loss of lashes. And this is a very typical presentation of a sebaceous gland carcinoma, the intraepithelial or the pagetoid variant, which has to be kept in mind. Treatment-resistant scleritis. So yet another case, this patient was treated as a case of scleritis, on and off steroids, the lesion goes away, then it comes back again, but very, very typically, you should always look for these corkscrew vessels. Anything which is having a dilated vessel over it, it may be a malignancy and it has to be ruled out. And something else that is very evident over here is the inferior fornicial lesion, which is adjacent to the main lesion over here. So a lymphoproliferative lesion was again kept as a differential diagnosis in this case, and it came out as an extramarginal zone lymphoma, multifocal, presenting and treated as a case of scleritis. I'm sure most of us know who practice ocular oncology that conjunctival squamous cell carcinoma can present as necrotizing scleritis with an invasive variant. And what you need to actually look for is again keratin over the surface of the sclera. As you can see here, it's just not the scleral melt. It is a lot of keratin, a heap of keratin, which is lying over the cornea, over the conjunctiva, which gave the diagnosis away, and the patient underwent extended enucleation. Now, the most important thing when an anterior segment specialist sends you to rule out is pterygium versus OSSN. Yes, there is a lot of similarity between both these lesions, and it has been reported that OSSN can also coexist with pterygium in 2% of the cases. Now, there are certain very classical characteristic features which we all know in order to differentiate OSSN from pterygium. As you can see here, pterygium, it usually has linear vessels and it's more thinner, whereas in OSSN, it's more thicker, it's more tortuous, it will be slightly more fleshy and more, elevated, and they will will be definitely some specks of keratin over the surface until and unless it's a papillary variant, which obviously doesn't look like a pterygium. So there has been a study where they also identified that a pterygium specimen which was submitted for pathology, OSSN was detected in 10% of the cases. So it's always good to send the pterygium specimen that you have for histopathological evaluation so that you don't miss an OSSN. But most of the time, they are in the severe dysplasia or CIN, not mostly an SEC or an invasive squamous cell carcinoma. Subconjunctival hemorrhage. So now this is a 35-year-old lady presenting with subconjunctival hemorrhage in the left eye for the past 2 months, referred to me in order to rule out a vascular malformation. But more than a vascular malformation over here, as obviously you can see the vessels are normal, it has some pinkish orangish appearance, which is subconjunctival over here. So what was kept in mind with the subconjunctival hemorrhage in the conjunctiva presenting with a lesion was amyloidosis. And it was proven to be primary localized amyloidosis, and a secondary involvement and a systemic involvement has to be definitely ruled out because it can be life-threatening sometimes. Although amyloidosis involves eyelid mainly, but it can involve the conjunctiva as well. Yet another case initially diagnosed as OSSN, referred tortuous vessels, but well, this eyelid lesion, the tarsal conjunctival involvement with this yellowish pinkish appearance was not really suiting into OSSN, and this also came out as amyloidosis presenting as a nodular conjunctival lesion. Now, fleshy conjunctival mass, yes, there can be confusion sometimes. A 65-year-old lady with reddish mass in the right eye, 6 months. Conjunctival lymphoma, yes, of course, it has got all the characteristic features of a conjunctival lymphoma. Tortuous vessel, salmon colorish, subconjunctival, elevated, sitting like glaring at you in the conjunctiva. But well, there is more to it. I'm taking the mask out here again. So a CT scan was done because anything which is in and around the caruncle, I almost make sure that an imaging is done in order to rule out any orbital, anterior orbital extension. And this is what we found, that it was a muscle lymphoma rather than a conjunctival lymphoma arising from the medial rectus muscle. It was extramarginal zone, no systemic involvement. Patient underwent ultra low dose radiotherapy, the boom boom therapy, and she's doing fine without any recurrence past 4 years. Another 72-year-old gentleman was referred in order to rule out lymphoma, lots of vessels over the surface, but it's not too fleshy. It was more of a transparent appearance, and this gave away the diagnosis. It was a conjunctival inclusion cyst, although it was vascular. So what is the diagnosis here? Is it a lymphoma, a squamous cell carcinoma, or others? Well, it is something else. So what you need to see here is it is fleshy, lots of vessels. Of course, it's a malignancy, and the speck of pigmentation from where it is arising. This is a case of a conjunctival melanoma, a melanotic secondary to PAM. So conjunctival pigmentation has to be kept and seriously looked into because it can turn into a lethal conjunctival melanoma. This is a very common, appearing lesion that is a racial complexion associated racial melanosis. But whenever there is more darker in color, it is asymmetric, more thicker, then you have to always rule out conjunctival melanoma. A very interesting case here, young patient, extensive lesion over sitting in the conjunctiva involving the eyelid margin, the tarsal conjunctiva, involving almost the upper eyelid, the lower fornix, the caruncle. Sumit, you want to give me the diagnosis quickly? And there are these white specks over it. You can see these white spots. Papilloma, OSSN. Anyone?
Sebaceous gland carcinoma?
Young patient, 30-year-old male. All right. You know what the diagnosis was? It was rhinosporidiosis. So even sometimes, infection can present as, aggressive as a malignancy. And this was from a village in Kerala. So excision was done and he's doing fine. Finally, last 2 slides on conjunctival malignant tumors in children. It's rare, but you have to be very, very careful in these children. A child presenting with this reddish mass in the left eye, 1 year. Elsewhere, it was diagnosed as neurofibroma. So the differential diagnosis that we should keep in mind in children with fleshy lesions in conjunctiva is rhabdomyosarcoma, leukemia, and lymphoma. But you know what? This came out to be a liposarcoma. Yet another case, underwent conjunctival excision elsewhere, histopathology not available, Sometimes the story is like this, and it was redone, re-excised, and it came out to be an alveolar rhabdomyosarcoma. So to conclude, conjunctival tumors have a wide clinical spectrum. A meticulous clinical assessment is very, very important, and definitely you will get some clinical clues, either from the history, symptoms, or signs to differentiate these masquerading lesions from the malignant ones. And if at doubt, always revisit the differential diagnosis. Thank you very much for your patient listening.
That was beautiful compilation of all the cases, ma'am. It was a feast to see. And of course, we do face a lot of this masquerade, and unless we do a proper imaging and the history, we might miss diagnosis most of the times. Thank you so much, ma'am. And in the interest of time, we'll move on with the next talk. We have Dr. Sonal Chowgule with us. Can you please share your slide? She has done her fellowship at Center for Sight with Dr. Santosh Honavar and also with Dr. Paul Finger. And now she is working at HV Desai Eye Hospital as an oculoplastic consultant. Over to you, Sonal.
Thank you, Sumit, for the introduction. All right, so after knowing about the eyelid tumors as well as the surface tumors, let's shift our sails and move on towards the intraocular tumors. Diagnosing intraocular tumors can be a very interesting as well as a daunting journey. In this limited time, I will take you all through some of the key features of commonly encountered intraocular tumors. More often than not, patients who present with intraocular tumors may complain of mundane complaints, for example, diminution of vision, gradual or sudden, flashes, or noticing flashes of floaters, or simply an intraocular tumor might be diagnosed during their routine fundus examination. Indirect ophthalmoscopy remains the very, very important essential tool in the toolbox of an ophthalmologist and ocular oncologist in diagnosing these tumors. The surface configuration, surface contour, color, location, size, site, everything can be documented via a thorough indirect ophthalmoscopy. Ancillary testings like ultrasound, B-scan, fundus photography, fundus autofluorescence imaging, microwave imaging, for example, OCT or OCTA in the newer imaging, and macro imagings, for example, CT scan or MRI, as well as PET CT scan, whole body PET CT scan, can give you the important diagnostic clues while coming to a confirmed diagnosis. Let's go through some of the common tumors. Starting with the choroidal melanoma, the most common primary intraocular tumor we encounter in adults. Choroidal melanomas can be both pigmented, that is melanotic, or amelanotic, commonly found to be more than 2 millimeter in thickness. The orange pigment on the top of the melanoma are characteristic because of the lipofuscin deposition, and they are accompanied with subretinal fluid or, if extensive, retinal detachment. This fundus picture highlights the presence of the orange pigment. This is because of the metabolic products of highly metabolizing cells, the lipofuscin, which is also highlighted on the fundus autofluorescence. When you go do a fundus fluorescence angiography in these tumors, you can see the classical double circulation. What we mean by that is the lighting up of retinal vessels as well as the intrinsic tumoral vascularity. Double circulation has been very pathognomically described for choroidal melanomas. On ultrasound, they are seen as moderate to low deflectile lesions owing to their homogeneous architecture. It can be dome-shaped or a mushroom configuration or diffuse. The twinkling that we just were seeing on dynamic ultrasound can be a characteristic because of intrinsic vascularity. This just shows an ultrasonographic documentation of the classically described mushroom configuration of the growing choroidal melanoma because of the break in Bruch's membrane it causes to grow into the retinal cavity. On OCT, they generally appear as a dome-shaped or irregular choroidal lesions accompanied with subretinal fluids, as well as shaggy photoreceptors telling you about the incidence of, the duration of the subretinal fluid. Newer OCT angiography can help show the reduced capillary density at the macula in tumors which involve the fovea as well as macula. Sometimes the pigmented scleral or episcleral lesion with a dilated sentinel vessel can be a presenting sign of the anterior located choroidal melanoma with an extrascleral extension. A close differential of this tumor, that is the choroidal melanoma, can also be choroidal hemorrhage. A large choroidal hemorrhage can sometimes simulate a condition similar to choroidal melanoma. A fundus fluorescence angiography will clear the confusion up by showing a blocked fluorescence. And also on dynamic ultrasound, what you can see is the classic after movement, which we can only see in choroidal hemorrhage and not in the melanoma. This just goes on to highlighting the importance of dynamic ultrasound instead of just viewing the 2D printed pages. It's essential to go through the videos of the ultrasound to see the exact composition of the tumor. Moving on to the benign variety we often encounter, the choroidal hemangioma. So choroidal hemangiomas are generally orange to red in color. They can be diffuse or circumscribed. Diffuse when in association with systemic syndromes, for example, Sturge-Weber syndrome. They are often accompanied with subretinal fluid and or retinal detachment, the occurrence of which are important to note because those are the factors which are going to cause visual symptoms, and those are the factors which are going to dictate your modality of treatment. On ultrasonography, because of the vascular nature of these tumors, high internal reflectivity is found. So the A-scan spikes are important to note here, along with the Doppler imaging if you have available. For fundus fluorescence angiography, early hyperfluorescence of the choroidal vessels, coarse fluorescence, and diffuse pattern fluorescence in late phase is characteristics of the choroidal hemangioma. OCT again will go on to show you a smoother appearance of the tumor with large dilated choriocapillaries as well as choroidal vessels, presence of subretinal fluid, here in this case foveal detachment, and shaggy photoreceptors can also be seen. Moving on to the next variety of choroidal tumors that we also encounter, choroidal metastasis. These are the tumors which can be diagnosed at the time of a known primary malignancy as well as can precede the diagnosis of a primary malignancy. So these tumors can be unilateral, single unilateral, or multifocal and bilateral. They can be accompanied with clear or turbid subretinal fluid or exudative retinal detachment. They are known to show rapid growth. The more commonly or not, they are yellowish in color, except some of the classic metastases, for example, from renal cell carcinoma or thyroid carcinoma, can be orangish red in color. So they can be easily confused with a case of melanotic choroidal melanomas, but what will give you a clue to diagnose is presence of retinal spicules on fundus autofluorescence, as well as the ultrasound imaging, which will show you a variable internal reflectivity as against the raw reflectivity of the choroidal melanoma. The primary sources can be lung, breast, prostate, colon, or kidney, which can give out a choroidal metastasis. On fundus fluorescence angiography, because of the multiple newer microaneurysms formed in the lesion, the starry sky pattern is classically described. Sometimes in advanced cases, they might present to you like this with a secondary glaucoma, secondary neovascular glaucoma, which after ultrasound B scan, you can see the presence of an intraocular mass. And at this time, the macroimaging in the form of whole body PET CT scan comes in handy to diagnose unknown primary, which in this case was a renal cell carcinoma. So this turned out to be a case of secondary glaucoma, secondary to metastasis from a renal cell carcinoma. Another important choroidal tumor, specifically suspected in a young individual, is a choroidal granuloma or tubercular choroidal granuloma, more commonly in our population. They tend to show irregular surface accompanying soft exudates or vasculitis, as well as retinal hemorrhages. The inflammatory signs are more pronounced on the FFA, and which are clues for apart from systemic investigations. Choroidal osteomas are the lesions which are seen with yellowish tinge or scalloping edges. They also may have intrinsic vascularity. However, the classic ultrasound, with high internal reflectivity and a significant orbital shadowing in behind the lesions can help you make a final diagnosis of osteomas. Fundus fluorescence angiography will show you a slow filling in the early phase and a persistent staining because of the high presence of calcium in these lesions. Moving on to vitreoretinal tumors. Retinoblastoma, the most common intraocular malignancy we see in children, can be endophytic, exophytic, or a diffuse pattern enlargement of these tumors. leukocoria or the white reflex being the most common presenting symptom. The intraocular calcification can be confirmed on ultrasound as well as CT scan imaging, which is quite pathognomic. Something which can be confused with advanced stages of retinoblastoma or advanced stages of Coats disease, specifically talking about the stage 4 and stage 5 here. So Coats disease is a telangiectatic neovascular disease of the retina, has to be kept in mind while examining a child with unilateral leukocoria or xanthocoria, which is the yellowish reflex which Coats disease can give. Another group of vitreoretinal tumors are primary intraocular lymphomas or vitreoretinal lymphomas. The examination findings may mimic presence of a chronic posterior uveitis. The vitreous cells can also give aurora borealis effect. Leopard spot or collection of subretinal pigmented lesions, as seen over here, can be diagnostic. Less often, they are associated with exudative RD, a visible mass, or even an optic nerve head swelling. So vitreoretinal lymphoma are basically a subset of primary CNS lymphomas. They may coexist or precede the development of CNS lymphoma. So a CNS screening is mandatory after diagnosing of a vitreoretinal lymphoma. Yeah. Moving on to the smaller subset of retinal pigment epithelial tumors. These are CHOPY, as we commonly know them, are more often than not incidentally diagnosed. What we have to look out for are the multiple or the atypical CHOPYs, which can be associated with familial adenomatous polyposis, so as to dictate a systemic screening. We can diagnose them because of the block fluorescence they provide on fundus angiography. Another variety is an RP adenocarcinoma, which can mimic choroidal melanomas, but a block fluorescence again on angiography can clear that right up. A little bit about optic nerve head tumors. Optic nerve head melanocytoma, again with a classical OCT picture of shadowing and hypofluorescence on angiography, can help diagnosing this condition. These patients can present with changed visual fields. Optic nerve head astrocytomas are paler looking lesions, which can be in association with tuberous sclerosis or other phakomatosis. So with that review, I'll acknowledge my mentors and their immense contribution in making me able to diagnose all these intraocular conditions. And I would also like to take a second to remind everyone that today is the commencement of the Retinoblastoma Awareness Week. So do your bit and identify the white as well as fight the white. Thank you. Thank you, Sumit. And thank you, the organizers for BOA as well as MOS for this great opportunity. And this has been a wonderful experience.
Thank you, Sonal. That was really a nice collection of all the pictures and all the cases. And you tried covering a lot in this few minutes, which was really enlightening to us, especially the use of that dynamic ultrasound to differentiate between choroidal hemorrhage and tumors. It was very nice. So in interest of time, we'll move ahead with the next talk. It is by Dr. Mahesh Shanmuganan, sir, about the surgical management of intraocular tumors. May I request you to share the screen, sir?
Thank you, Dr. Sumit.
Yes.
Give me and you can see my slides, right?
Yes, we can see it.
Thanks to Professor Lahane, Sumit, the BOA and the MOS for this opportunity to meet you all virtually. All of us, I'm sure, are dying to meet each other in person, and I hope that we'll be able to get to that very, very soon. So I'm going to talk about surgeries for posterior segment tumors in the next 8 minutes. So these are not surgeries which are destructive. So I'm going to talk about surgery which are other than enucleation. Dr. Sonal did a great job of showing all the different types of tumors in about 8 minutes time. So when would we have to intervene in these patients for surgical options other than enucleation? One could be diagnostic. So the diagnosis can be an FNAB or using vitreoretinal techniques. So we may have to remove the vitreous or piece of the tumor for diagnostic purposes. Or it could be therapeutic to treat the tumor or to treat the associated complications because of the tumor. So the most common indication for vitreous biopsy is the primary intraocular lymphoma. So if you had to do a biopsy, we have to stop the steroids 2 weeks before and use a low cut of the vitreous cutter so that the cells don't get macerated, remove all the cells and send for immunohistochemistry as well as cytology. Next one is FNAB. Most often I do an FNAB with the indirect ophthalmoscope. Here I'm doing a vitrectomy and then doing an FNAB. You can see the needle plunging into the mass lesion. This was a metastasis without a known primary, so we did a biopsy following which we were able to get a diagnosis. So the tissue which we get is what is in the tip of the needle, and it's aspirated into the syringe with the BSS and then sent for analysis. In certain cases, we may have to do an incisional biopsy. This was a young gentleman with a pigmented lesion arising from the ciliary body. I thought it was a melanocytoma of the ciliary body and not a melanoma, because melanocytoma, in which case you can try to save the eye. So we went ahead with the biopsy. So here we have raised the partial thickness scleral flap, and a very thin area of the sclera is left behind, and that bit of the sclera along with the tumor is excised. As you can see, the tumor is dark in color, not brown in color or gray in color. This is suggestive of melanocytoma. So this child who did have melanocytoma, which was treated with the brachytherapy, and we managed to save the eye. Moving on to the next series of surgeries, a therapeutic surgery for saving the eye. This was a young gentleman who had a mass lesion on the nasal side. It was a suprachoroidal tumor, and we did a biopsy to find out that it was indeed a schwannoma, actually, of the arising from the ciliary body region. So this is a non-malignant lesion. So we went ahead and tried resecting this lesion. So here we create a full thickness scleral flap. So this is the area where I had done a biopsy, the incisional biopsy. So the sclera is separated from the choroid very, very gently. We didn't want to rupture the choroid and have a vitreous loss in the retinal detachment. So what we see here, this is the schwannoma, which is sitting on the surface of the choroid. The choroid can be seen beautifully. The uvea, the name uvea comes from the appearance of a grape. So that's how it looks like. And this lesion, the schwannoma is excised, is gently peeled off from the choroid and the ciliary body. And I'm using an endocrine probe to hold on to the tumor and remove it. So fortunately, we didn't rupture the choroid and we didn't have vitreous loss. And this is the scleral patch graft, with the scleral graft being closed. This was the site where I had done an incisional biopsy, and that had opened up in the meantime. A little bit of tumor tissue which was sticking around it was removed, and the eye was closed. This is the post-op appearance. The lesion is not there, and he continues to enjoy 6/6 vision. So such resections can rarely be done for anterior malignant tumors. This is a patient with an iridociliary melanoma, what we see here. So we did a phacoemulsification and endocapsular ring, because once I remove the tumor, that area of the capsular support will not be there. So we put an endocapsular ring. Again, we have made a partial thickness scleral flap, and this is the iris part of the lesion which is being removed by doing a peripheral iridectomy using the intraocular micro scissors. So this way I want to avoid doing a sectoral iridectomy. So once again, a deep penetrating diathermy to the bed, entry into the anterior chamber. We have to remove the iris, the ciliary body, and part of this sclera. So this lesion is being removed completely. And the vitreous which is prolapsing is being removed with the vitreous cutter. You can see the mass lesion in the excised specimen. So close the eye. Another treatment which we do often is brachytherapy. So this is again a sight-saving and the eye-saving treatment. Most often it is done for medium-sized melanomas, select retinoblastomas, and vascular tumors, particularly choroidal hemangiomas or retinal angiomas, which are too large for local treatment, can be treated with brachytherapy. What we see here is the ruthenium plaque, which is being placed episclerally overlying the tumor. And until the dosage of the radiation is delivered, the plaque is left in place and then removed. Moving on to third part, there is therapeutic surgery managing associated complications which come with the tumor treatment or tumor itself. This is a peripapillary angioma with an exudative retinal detachment. It was very difficult to treat the way it was. So we wanted to drain the subretinal fluid. So here I'm draining the subretinal fluid transclerally. What you see here is the transscleral needle going under the retina and draining the exudative retinal detachment. Because the retina was lifted up so much that we were not able to treat the tumor, we wanted to drain the subretinal fluid, reattach the retina, and then go ahead doing laser photocoagulation for the tumor. It was a long-standing tumor, so the visual prognosis was a little poor, so I didn't opt for a photodynamic therapy, instead did laser photocoagulation. Traction retinal detachment is often associated with vascular tumors, particularly retinal angiomas. So what we see here is a treated retinal angioma, the scarring because of laser photocoagulation and cryo. So it forms a dense scar. You can see the macula is pulled up, and that's the scar tissue which is causing the traction at the macula and traction retinal detachment. Very gently, the scar tissue and the posterior hyaloid is removed, taking care not to create a retinal break. The bridging traction is removed. So the key is not to have a break, because once we have a break, it will be very difficult to attach to the retina. A laser photocoagulation for the tumor is done. This is the pre and post appearance. You can see the blood vessels have regressed and the macula has gone back to its normal place. Regumatosis retinal detachment can complicate tumors rarely, and this is one such patient with angiomatosis retinae familial. So I placed a buckle over the tumor and doing a vitrectomy. This patient had a macular hole, which was the reason for the regumatosis retinal detachment. So we're draining the fluid from the macular hole, and had this peripheral tumor, extremely peripheral tumor. So inducing the posterior vitreous detachment and doing a vitrectomy, and this macular hole has to be tackled. So put a bubble of perfluorocarbon, stain it with the BBG, and do an ILM peeling and stuff it into the hole. Then I thought that supporting the tumor with the buckle would be adequate, but then the scarring was so dense it wouldn't attach. So we went ahead resecting the tumor. I don't usually resect angiomas, large angiomas, because that can result in severe scarring, but this is a small angioma, a small area, so we went ahead resecting the tumor as well as the scar tissue associated with it. Reattached the retina with laser photocoagulation, and you can see the break is sitting on the buckle nicely, and use silicone oil for tamponade. Otherwise, I usually do brachytherapy for large angiomas and treat it with a limited vitrectomy. Now, very rarely we are doing vitrectomy in active retinoblastomas, particularly in one-eyed children where the eye may be lost otherwise. So here you see one such. The other eye had been removed, and this child has been treated elsewhere, came with retinal detachment with severe PVR. Leaving it alone, this eye would have been lost. So we did a very careful vitrectomy, then reattached the retina, and all these special precautions would have to be taken. The special precautions are techniques to avoid spillage of cells, melphalan or topotecan in the infusion to kill the cells. Distilled water once again kills retinoblastoma cells. And all this is done under intravenous chemotherapy cover. And I'm a little bit more liberal with these patients with the external beam radiation therapy to kill the cells which may have spilled onto the orbit or in the subconical space. So to summarize, intraocular surgery for intraocular tumors, various reasons are there. The commonest is biopsy, which could be just a fine needle aspiration biopsy or a vitrectomy. Benign lesions, we may have to do an excision biopsy. Therapeutic could be to treat the tumor or associated complications. And then malignant tumors, resection can be done for anterior tumors, brachytherapy for posterior malignant lesions, and vitrectomy can be used to manage complications such as a traction detachment, regumatosis retinal detachment. And in malignant lesions, if you were to intervene, particularly those with retinoblastoma, all kinds of care has to be taken to make sure that we are not resulting in extraocular spread of the tumor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. That was those are really wonderful surgical videos and wonderful collection of the cases. Any questions from the panelists for the sir? Anyone? Yes, Feroz ma'am. Yes.
Hi, sir.
Dr. Feroz.
Hi, sir. So I have two questions for you, sir. The excision of ciliary body melanoma that you showed, do you have any, size-wise, any indication of, this particular size can be excised, or beyond that it could be, radiated? Is there any particular thing that you would take into consideration?
Around 1/3 to 1/4 of the ciliary body can be excised, because we need to give a clearance as well. So including the clearance, about 1/3 to 1/4 would be the ideal one. 1/3, yeah, we can just push the margins a little bit and then do it. So 1/3, sometimes what I do is to resect it and put a plaque overlaying that as well. So these can be resected safely without the eye going in for a phthisis and decrease risk of complications.
So you don't put a plaque always?
Not all the time. If the margins are adequate enough, I don't put a plaque all the time.
Okay, sir. So another question, obviously you have seen so many intraocular tumors. What is your experience about leiomyoma, ciliary body and, extending into a choroid?
Leiomyoma I have come across, but unfortunately I have managed them with enucleation rather than resection. So that is one such patient, one such tumor which can be resected because of the location and it's not malignant in that sense of the word. But I will come across one where I have managed to resect. So it's a little bit, another thing is it's a little bit posteriorly located. So posterior lesions to resect becomes a little bit difficult as well. So I have come across, but I have not resected any of them so far.
Okay, so it's usually inside the choroid, not outside the choroid. So then it might become difficult to excise it also, no?
So we can remove it along with the choroid also. Only thing it becomes a little bit larger defect. Like a uveal melanoma also we can resect by creating a flap and doing it. But once it extends posterior, it becomes a bit difficult to do such a large excision. So if it's anteriorly placed, yes, we can do it.
Okay, okay, all right. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. And then we will go ahead with the next talk by Dr. Nandan Shetty, sir, on advances in the retinoblastoma. Sir, please share your screen.
So, thank you, Sumit. And I take this opportunity to thank Professor Lahane, Team BOA, and Maharashtra Ophthalmic Society for this kind invitation. I will be speaking today on the current trends in the management of advanced intraocular retinoblastoma. We are aware that retinoblastoma is a malignant tumor affecting young children, and the global burden of this disease lies in the lesser developed nations, and India sees a large number of cases. It is estimated that India sees about 1,500 to 2,000 new cases of retinoblastoma every year. The treatment of retinoblastoma has evolved over the last century, starting with the era of enucleation, followed by the era of external beam radiation, which was followed by intravenous chemotherapy from the 1990s. And of late, in the last 1 decade, we are seeing more and more of targeted chemotherapy, namely intra-arterial and intravitreal chemotherapy. So what exactly is advanced retinoblastoma? The clinical spectrum could be an advanced intraocular retinoblastoma, like you see in the top right picture here, or you could see an orbital retinoblastoma and metastatic retinoblastoma, the last two being extraocular disease. The international classification classifies intraocular retinoblastoma from A to E, and what we'll be focusing today are the groups D and E, which see a higher disease load within the eye. This compare with the TNM classification as CT2 and CT3. So this is an example of a group D retinoblastoma on the left side of the slide. You can see the disc very hazily because the vitreous is filled with vitreous seeds. Whereas on the right side, you see a large exophytic tumor with retinal detachment. These are both examples of advanced intraocular retinoblastoma. You should always remember that the primary aim of treatment is to save life, with the secondary goals being to save eye or vision if possible. So when we treat a patient with advanced unilateral retinoblastoma, the preferred treatment options in our center now remain intraarterial chemotherapy with or without intravitreal chemotherapy at a later stage. In cases where eye salvage is not possible, enucleation does remain a very valid treatment option for unilateral cases. For bilateral retinoblastoma, we generally start with systemic chemotherapy with the aim of chemoreducing the tumor, followed by focal therapy and periocular chemotherapy as an initial treatment. Chemotherapy is generally given in 6 cycles of 3 drugs, and up from cycle 2 or 3 onwards, you will start to see, as we see in this example here, with chemotherapy started, the tumor regresses and it moves, it shrinks and it moves away towards the source of its blood supply. And at this stage now, you start applying focal therapy. Periocular chemotherapy is injection of the chemotherapeutic agent around the globe in the deep posterior subclinical space. Drugs commonly used earlier were carboplatin, but nowadays we have shifted towards topotecan because of its better safety profile. A paper in 2005 by Dr. Honavar's group showed a nearly 70% eye salvage in cases with diffuse vitreal seeds. In bilateral retinoblastoma, intraarterial chemotherapy can be considered if there is an inadequate response to the conventional intravenous chemotherapy. So what is targeted therapy? The advantages of targeted therapy is basically you are having a higher drug concentration at a tumor location with minimal to nil systemic side effects. The efficacy of treatment is much better and your treatment goals are better achieved with this treatment. So intraarterial chemotherapy goes by a lot of other names. It is also known as super selective intraarterial chemotherapy or ophthalmic artery chemoinfusion or chemosurgery. So what is done is through a transfemoral approach, a very fine microcatheter is inserted and you go right up in the internal carotid artery and in the ostium of the ophthalmic artery, you insert the microcatheter. This is done under fluoroscopic guidance, and the drug is injected in a pulsatile fashion over half an hour. The drugs commonly used are melphalan, topotecan, and carboplatin, or you can use combination of these drugs. So tumor response of the intraocular chemotherapy is quite dramatic. In generally 2 or 3 sessions, you see a very dramatic response. As you see in this picture here, on the left was the pre-treatment and on the right is the post-treatment picture. Another example shows a group D retinoblastoma, which after 3 sessions of IAC shows a very dramatic response. So the next targeted chemotherapy is intravitreal chemotherapy, in which the drug is directly injected into the vitreous cavity by a very specialized safety enhanced technique. This was once considered to be a forbidden technique to inject anything in an eye with an active tumor because of fear of extra ocular spread. However, with a proper technique, this has been shown to be very safe. There was a landmark paper in 2012 by Professor Munir, and this has revolutionized the treatment of vitreous seeds. So here you see in the picture on the right, you have a tumor with seeds next to the tumor and within the vitreous space. These seeds are typically unresponsive to standard therapy because the concentration of the chemotherapeutic drug by systemic chemotherapy is generally poor. So if the seeds are not responding to standard therapy or you have recurrent seeds, intravitreal chemotherapy is considered. The drugs which are commonly used are melphalan and topotecan. Melphalan is the most effective drug. However, it's also the most toxic drug. The therapeutic window for melphalan is very narrow. If you go below the recommended dose, you will have no effect. And if you go more than the recommended dose, you may have phthisis. So the window is very tight from 20 to 30 micrograms. However, in the Indian eyes, we are seeing more inflammatory reaction with melphalan, and topotecan has found to be equally effective and much safer. So nowadays, topotecan is generally preferred in our population. So the technique here is a safety enhanced technique where you select a quadrant without the tumor and you inject in the pars plana. And while you are exiting, after giving the injection, you have to apply cryotherapy to the injection tract so as to sterilize any extravasating cells. Here you see after intravitreal chemotherapy on the left side, there's a large number of vitreous seeds, some clouds. It's a significant vitreous disease, but after about 2 or 3 injections, you can see a dramatic response and the seeds have all melted away. So intravitreal chemotherapy is a safe and effective technique, and with the proper technique, there is no documented case of any extraocular spread with this technique. So which chemotherapy to use when? If you are starting primary therapy in a bilateral case, it's best to start with intravenous chemotherapy along with periocular chemotherapy if you have vitreous seeds. However, in unilateral cases, if the child is more than 6 months, you can consider intraarterial to be a first line of treatment. For secondary or recurrent retinoblastoma, intraarterial chemotherapy plays a much bigger role. And for vitreous seeding, intravitreal chemotherapy is having a near 100% success rate. Now, enucleation remains a very important treatment option in the retinoblastoma management, and it is to be employed in a very refined technique using a gentle and safe operating technique. We have to look for the high-risk pathological features after enucleation to decide on the need for possible adjuvant treatment. A mention about a new targeted chemotherapy called intracameral chemotherapy, which is indicated for aqueous seeding, that is tumor cells entering the anterior chamber. It is contraindicated if there's invasion of the Schlemm's canal, which is seen on the UBM. So the takeaway points from my lecture is retinoblastoma management has changed dramatically over the past 10 years with increasing use of intraarterial chemotherapy and intravitreal chemotherapy. And the enucleation rates have dropped significantly over the past 10 years, with intravitreal chemotherapy changing the management of vitreous disease with a near 100% response in many case series. And all this without compromising on the patient survival rates. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. That was quite extensive talk and the lucid presentation on the management of advanced retinoblastoma. you must be getting a lot of it at the center place where you're working. We have left with the last but not the least talk of the session. It's by Dr. Santosh Unava sir on moving to the orbit now from intraocular tumors. Orbital biopsy, how deep is deep? Dr. Santosh sir, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there. Thank you. Nandan, can you unshare your slide?
So Dr. Santosh sir does not need any introduction. The half of the people in this session itself are mentored by him, and he is one of the person who we should credit for crafting this beautiful program. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Sumit, for all the hard work and for the kind invitation. I'll be speaking about incisional biopsy in orbital tumors. Did you know that 8 to 20% of orbital biopsies result in non-specific or misleadingly wrong diagnosis, thus affecting the management and outcome? And that's possibly because of unrepresentative sample, where the sample is taken from an area where the tumor may be atypical or may not be present, or non-uniform pathology in particular lesions, such as lymphoproliferative lesions can have a component of benign and reactive lymphoid hyperplasia and also lymphoma. Sometimes because of inflammatory element which is associated with a necrotic tumor, you might biopsy the tissue response or tissue reaction, which is in the more superficial layer around the tumor. So by protocol, we do multi-layered biopsy in all orbital tumors, at least 3 layers, and go beyond the tumor epicenter. What I mean by tumor epicenter is this. On radiology, if you assess that this is a particular tumor, just doing a biopsy from a superficial portion is not enough. Going to the mid-center is also not enough. But going beyond the center to the epicenter and beyond to the other side, crossing over to the other side is very important. So you do a superficial, mid-zonal, and a deep biopsy. And all that is sent to the pathologist. That will help you pick up the diagnosis in nearly 100% of patients. For example, this is a patient, young child with a superior orbital mass. As you see.
Excuse me, sir. Sorry to interrupt. The slides are not moving.
Slides are not moving.
No, sir. We are just seeing that orbital. Yes.
Really, I'll again share it. It's moving on my laptop. Is it moving?
No, sir. Now it's we can't see the screen at present. Yeah, now we can see the screen.
Okay. Can you see the screen?
It's not full screen yet, sir. Now we can see a histopathological slide.
I don't know why is that happening.
Sir. Now.
Let me check it. I'll share again. Let me
Yes,
sorry
sir.
for the technical.
No problem.
Is that seen now?
Yes, sir. Now we can see the whole presentation.
All right. So I was talking about epicenter of a tumor. So I was trying to draw it up. Probably you didn't see at all. So this is the tumor, and if this is the epicenter, this is the superficial biopsy. This is mid-zonal, and this large, deeper biopsy will go past the epicenter, and that is how deep you must go. Example I was showing was this child with rhabdomyosarcoma, superior orbital mass. Now let's see what all we got. In the superficial biopsy, we got only inflammation and fibrosis. And that was the superficial biopsy. There we got only inflammation and fibrosis. That was the tissue reaction. And as we went deeper, we got embryonal rhabdomyosarcoma, which was very typical on histopathology and also immunohistochemistry. This was a 55-year-old male who presented with a right orbital mass. You can see a mass in the superior orbit there, which is along the superior rectus LPS complex, resulting in ptosis and also an anterior orbital mass. When we did a superficial biopsy, we got, of course, a diagnosis that was lymphoproliferative lesion, benign reactive lymphoid hyperplasia. The same patient showed polyclonality on immunohistochemistry. When the deep biopsy was analyzed, it was confirmed that it was extranodal marginal zone lymphoma, and it was monoclonal on immunohistochemistry. Suppose we were to do only superficial biopsy in this patient, we would think that this patient has a benign reactive lymphoid hyperplasia and possibly treat with steroids. Whereas now that lymphoma is confirmed, he needs external beam radiation. So this is the same patient following EBRT, his lesion is regressed. Now this is a patient who presented with conjunctival chemosis and redness for several weeks. And
Sorry to interrupt, sir, once again.
Mhm.
Again, the slide has been stuck. Feroz ma'am, can you see the slide which sir
No,
is
sir,
trying?
sir, I think, yeah, so the previous slides are being seen, sir. Can you just change the slide? Can you just click and see?
Is it seen?
No, now it's not moving at all.
We are on the
can see
immunohistochemistry slides.
let's see. Now it is. The MRI is visible now.
Right, I don't know why is that happening. Never had this problem, new problem.
There's a lag as you speak also.
Hmm?
There's a lag as you speak also. We are seeing it's not your voice and mouth are actually not syncing. I know why.
Maybe you can stop your video, like your video, and just speak. Probably sometimes it helps with Zoom. Yeah.
Sure. I'll do.
Yeah. Or is it your fancy marker?
No. I use it all the time. I have so many Zoom meetings.
Okay.
This is the first experience of this sort. Anyway, let me share again.
Maybe you can keep your video.
It's okay, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll put off my video. Let me see. Otherwise, we'll skip this talk and you can move on to the next slide. Is it seen now?
Yes,
Yes, sir.
Is it moving?
it is.
Okay. So this was the young, elderly patient that I was talking about, 42-year-old male who presented with conjunctival congestion and chemosis. And which was not responding to antibiotics, he was thought to have an orbital abscess. And that is the cavity that you see in the deep orbit. Superficial biopsy showed minimum inflammation and fibrosis. When we went deep, we could get xanthogranulomatous inflammation and necrobiosis. So when we went further deep, we found that it was orbital actinomycosis. So we could have missed the diagnosis if we were to be just superficial and mid-zonal in this patient. In the same patient, after having been treated with antibiotics, that is benzyl penicillin, he completely recovered over a period of time. Now, this was a young adult with bilateral displacement of the eyeball laterally. So basically, he has developed an acquired telecanthus because of a midline lesion, which is asymmetrical more on the left side and less on the right side. You can see the extensiveness of the lesion. He is immunocompetent and is absolutely asymptomatic except for the displacement, and recently has developed a slight deterioration of vision on the left side because of optic nerve compression. So here, superficial biopsy showed inflammation and fibrosis. Are we seeing the slides now moving well?
Yes, sir, they are moving well.
Deep biopsy showed granulomatous inflammation and multinucleate giant cells. And on specific stain on histopathology, that is GMS stain, we could see fungal elements, and it was confirmed a case of fungal granuloma in an immunocompetent individual, and the same patient after being treated with antifungals. So we could have again missed the diagnosis and thought it was non-specific orbital inflammation if you were to only do a superficial biopsy. This is a patient with a medial orbital lesion along the medial rectus muscle. You can see that it is an isodense lesion relatively so. Superficial biopsy showed dense fibrosis with minimal inflammation. Deep biopsy showed perivascular granuloma, which was suggestive of vaginous granulomatosis. So this patient had a specific cause for her orbital inflammation. So summarizing all the experience that we have had over several years, I would say that pediatric or adult round cell tumors, peripheral biopsy shows only inflammation with fibrosis, and intermediate zone actually shows the tumor, and the deep zone shows necrosis because round cell tumors have a typical preponderance to undergo tumor necrosis. So it is the intermediate zone, that red zone, that shows the tumor. And in any case, you have to do multi-layered biopsy and you will pick up all the layers. In case of lymphoma, the deep zone shows the tumor. Intermediate zone can also show a tumor, but the peripheral zone, the yellow zone, shows benign or atypical lymphoid hyperplasia if it is a lymphoma in evolution. In granulomatous inflammation of non-infective etiology, peripheral zone often shows only fibrosis. Intermediate zone shows non-specific inflammation, whereas the deep zone shows classic characteristics of specific etiology such as vaginal granulomatosis. Fungus in an immunocompetent individual, only the deep zone shows the fungus, whereas the superficial shows peripheral fibrosis and the intermediate zone shows inflammation. In orbital tuberculosis, again, it is the intermediate zone that shows the pathology, whereas deep zone shows necrosis and the periphery shows fibrosis. So, in several patients, I would say about 15 to 20% of patients, the various layered biopsy is the one which clinches the diagnosis, and just a superficial biopsy or a mid-zonal biopsy will not help. So in conclusion, I would say that in orbital biopsy, layered approach is very important. Superficial, intermediate, and deep beyond the epicenter. And the estimation of depth is based on imaging, CT or MRI, which you would have done preoperatively, will tell you how deep you must go in a given case. And we must always collect a sample for microbiology and specific tests for histopathology, and keep a sample reserved for PCR in case it is required based on the histopathology findings. And if you're worried that you may not have the right tissue plane or the right tissue, and you have to close the case because of its bleeding, etc., then it's a good idea to get an intraoperative frozen section or imprint of or squash cytology to know whether you have reached the tissue of interest. This could be done intraoperatively. So if the diagnosis is very critical. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, sir. That was really wonderful presentation, and actually insightful to know about the orbital biopsy. Dr. Lahane sir has joined here in the presentation.
Santosh,
Yes, sir.
thank
Good
you
evening,
very
sir.
much for excellent scientific feast, calling everybody, coordinating, and organizing such a nice session. Thank you very much, Santosh. And I was listening to you. It was a very, very, I think, good talk. And thank you very much, Santosh.
Thank you, sir.
And thank you for all the participants and all the faculty and moderators, co-moderators, and chairman. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Go ahead, Santosh.
Any questions from the panelists for the Santosh sir, or any other talk before we wind up? Yeah.
I have a question mainly for the listeners in the audience. So most of the time the question arises is, what is the role of FNAB in orbital tumors? Would you want to tell us?
FNAB is very, very limited role. Only if you cannot do a biopsy for a specific reason, if its surgery is contraindicated or whatever, then you have a role for FNAC, because pathologists generally won't get much of tissue to be able to do immunohistochemistry reliably or look at the architecture of the tumor. In tumor, there are two components which are important, not just the cells, but the architecture in which these cells are located and the surrounding reaction. So if you want to get all of that, then an open biopsy is mandated.
So, and now regarding the approach of biopsy, like, I have learned from you, especially from, lacrimal gland adenoid cystic carcinoma, where now we use the multimodal treatment protocol where you go and actually take an incision biopsy. Right. So in order to prevent the spillage of the tumor, recurrence, what is the extra precaution that you take in such situation?
Any patient where you plan to perform chemotherapy and radiation as additional treatment, adjuvant treatment, you have to have a uniplanar biopsy. Uniplanar incision is the one where you make your incision directly on the area where you're going to take biopsy from. For example, if there is a lacrimal gland tumor and you go with a lid crease incision with the only purpose of debulking or doing an incisional biopsy, that is detrimental to the patient, because then you would have seeded the tumor in the subcutaneous plane, suborbicularis plane, the septum, everything. So it is impossible for a radiation oncologist to plan to give radiation in such a patient. And these patients do recur in various tissue planes. So it is always a good idea to make an incision right on top of the tumor. That is subro incision or a lateral subtoe incision for a lacrimal gland tumor to reach the area of interest directly without passing through multiple tissue layers.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. That was a really nice session. Thank you, the panelists. Thank you, Mahesh sir. Thank you, Fairuz ma'am. Thank you, Chinmay ma'am, everyone.